So first I want to say thank you, Jim, for that great introduction. If you missed Jim's really kind introduction, he said this project has been productive in part because the collaborative process has been really strong. And so I really want to thank Ona Ferguson and Sarah Fernald. Ona Ferguson is with the Consensus Building Institute and has really helped to bring together stakeholders and the project team. And Sarah Fernald is the research coordinator for the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. And she as well has just done a great job in helping the project team and stakeholders connect, connecting us with data, and really helped me think about some of these things that I'm going to talk about today. I did want to start the presentation by acknowledging what a strange time it is. Thank you folks who are here for logging in. From my house, I'm not really sure if I'm talking to anyone, but I assume there's other people on the end of this. And I'm going to try to keep the chat open so that I can see if people have questions or concerns about the technical stuff. I wanted to start by just saying everyone's going through this a little differently right now. I'm sure there are folks on the line who have had friends, family with coronavirus, and so heart goes out to you. For me, coronavirus has looked like a lot of home time. My wife and I are sort of splitting time between work and kids and sort of tag teaming. And despite, I'm lucky to get to spend time with my kids, and part of what we've been doing is just getting outside a lot. We're lucky to live in rural Western Massachusetts. We have lots of space to roam around. So here's a picture of us looking at a head cut across an alluvial plain. The picture on the left here is my daughter standing at, this will eventually become, I think, the channel of this sort of medium-sized stream. And then this is a little ways downstream on the same brook. This was yesterday after we had over 2 inches of rain. And you can see this river's really chock-a-block full of sediment. And so that's sort of live and breathe for sediment. And so that's what we'll be looking at today. Thank you for sticking around. What we'll be talking about today is a collaborative project that started in 2016. And the fundamental question was, to what extent do small dams littered throughout the landscape trap sediment in the uplands, prevent that sediment from getting down to estuarine locations like this tidal marsh where Caroline Ladlow and Waverly Lau are standing in this picture? I do want to acknowledge the various sources of funding that have helped this project move forward. And also, of course, want to acknowledge my collaborators and the advisory committee that has worked with us. So as Jim mentioned, there was this project is the result of a broad group of stakeholders, and I'm acting today as messenger for some of this information, but none of this would have been possible without the collaboration of this long list of collaborators and the project team made up of 4 field scientists and Ona Ferguson, who has sort of helped to coordinate us. So in short, these stakeholders represent a broad range of interests, everyone from dam owners, individuals who own small dams, all the way up to New York City, who owns obviously several large dams that supply many of us with fresh water, dam regulators, including the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, environmental regulators at the state of New York who permit dam removals, fisheries folks who are interested in the removal of dams to promote fish passage, folks who are interested in tidal wetlands, as well as practitioners, engineers and consulting firms who are in the business of removing dams. And moving forward, I think we'll see more and more folks getting into the work of marsh restoration and marsh creation. The Hudson River Estuary Comprehensive Restoration Plan calls for the creation of some 3,500 acres of new marsh throughout the estuary, and calls for over $3 billion of funding to do that. And so a lot of this work is motivated by trying to better understand what has led to successful marsh creation in the past, or marsh initiation and growth. And then again, to what extent are these dams playing a role in denying sediment to the downstream environments? So here I'll just show sort of a pictographic summary of the project. These are the 1,700 or so dams in the lower Hudson River watershed. And so the area shaded in here with topography represents the portion of the Hudson River catchment that drains directly to the tidal river, directly to the estuary. And again, there are 1,700 dams within it. And this is just those that are registered in the Army Corps' National Database of Dams. So about half of the watershed drains directly to the estuary. In order to study this question, to what extent are these small dams potentially trapping sediment and starving the coast or estuaries of sediment needed for tidal marshes to maintain elevation and keep pace with sea level rise, we looked at 3 of the National Estuarine Research Reserve's long-term study sites. And these sites are Stockport Flats, with a marsh right here, the furthest upstream, Tivoli Bays, which is actually a paired system. There's Tivoli North Bay and Tivoli South Bay, and then Iona Island Marsh, which was the closest to New York City, about 50 kilometers upstream from the battery. So for each of these marsh systems, we looked at the watershed that drains directly to that marsh and tried to find 6 dams that were representative of typical dams and typical upstream catchments within each of these broader watersheds. And so I'll start by zooming in on the Stockport Creek watershed. And the first half of the talk will be devoted toward the dam side of the question. The question being, to what extent are dams depriving the estuary of sediment? So this is the Stockport Creek watershed. There are 97 dams in it. And in order, part of the question, in order to know how much are dams denying downstream environments of sediment, we had to know 2 things. 1, how much sediment is in behind the dams, and 2, how much sediment typically makes it to the Hudson River estuary. There have been past estimates of how much sediment does get to the estuary, but we look to refine those estimates somewhat by using existing gauge data, so looking at USGS gauges, and then also using these dams themselves to see, can we figure out how much sediment is coming off the landscape on an annual basis. So first I'll talk about the effort to do that with the USGS gauges. So here we're looking at sediment discharge rating curves for 11 USGS gauges. Each of these red dots represents a USGS gauge, which we've used to make a plot of discharge, river discharge on the x-axis, so that's this QR, and sediment discharge in tons per day on the y-axis. Each of the black dots on each of these points represents an individual water sample. Someone went out to the creek, to the river, grabbed a water sample, or an auto sampler pumped a sample. That sample then got filtered, and they quantified the amount of sediment in a sample of water. It was a very labor-intensive process, and we're lucky in this region to have really an abundance of data. It's not enough to answer this question. We'll never know the exact answer of how much sediment makes it to the river, but in the Hudson, we sort of have a good head start. So these 11 gauges cover about 80% of the whole Hudson River watershed. The 2 biggest being the Mohawk River and the Upper Hudson. So the 2 gauges on the Mohawk and the Upper Hudson. These comprise about half the water and sediment entering the estuary. And then with the remaining gauges, we can make up another 30%. And from those, extrapolate for the whole watershed how much sediment we think is entering the estuary. So each of these curves, as I mentioned, is called a sediment discharge rating curve. Discharge is a decent predictor of how much sediment is coming down the river on a given day. These are highly nonlinear relationships, and so they're plotted here in log space so that we can see the upper ends of the curves. And one thing I want you to notice is that these red lines, which fit the data, are in slightly different locations. The further left it is, so the closer it is to the sediment load axis or to the y-axis, that's the more sediment productive a given river is. So if we look at the Schoharie Creek, which we know has a lot of sediment coming out of it, we see the red line is slightly above the 1-to-1, a 1-to-1 line, And if we look at, for instance, the upper Hudson right here, the line's much closer to the x-axis, indicating a much less sediment-rich system. So we can use these sediment discharge relationships, multiply, and then use long-term records of river discharge to figure out the sediment yield of individual creeks. And so here's what that looks like on this plot. On this plot, we're looking at watershed area on the x-axis, sediment yield on the y-axis. And so sediment yield is the amount of sediment per unit area, so per square kilometer per year, that comes out of a watershed. And what you'll notice is there is a general negative relationship such that the largest watersheds have the lowest sediment yields. That doesn't mean there's less sediment coming out of it. It means per unit area, there's less sediment. And one of the main reasons for that is the larger and larger a watershed becomes, the more low gradient areas you incorporate, areas to store sediment in floodplains and whatnot. We'll first look at the upper Hudson and the Mohawk. Each gauge has 3 different ways by which we computed the sediment yield. I won't get into the details right now because I think it's a bit cumbersome. But what I do want you to see is that the upper Hudson has a relatively lower sediment yield than the Mohawk. And that makes sense from what we know, both the geology of the Mohawk River, where there's a lot more clays in the watershed, and the land use, where there's a lot more agriculture, are contributing to the higher watershed yield of the Mohawk. Second, I'll just zoom in on 2 more gauges. The Esopus, this red indicates west of Hudson. This is the Colebrook gauge above Ashokan Reservoir, and you can see a relatively high sediment yield. Below Ashokan Reservoir, the sediment yield is predictably much lower because of so much sediment being trapped within the reservoir itself. And last, I'll highlight this gauge right here, Stony Cove. This is in the headwaters of the Esopus Creek up in the Catskill Mountains. And it's sort of one of the real problem issues for Ashokan Reservoir in terms of sediment delivery to the reservoir. You can see here it has a relatively high sediment yield, depending on which methodology we use for calculating. In total, we aggregate all of these data and come up with an estimate for the amount of sediment being delivered to the Hudson River estuary on an annual basis. So this will be an important number throughout the day, throughout the talk, about 1.2 megatons per year. So about 1. And of course, that varies depending on annual hydrology and weather. But that was sort of the best estimate we could come up with. And it's close to previous estimates, but we think a little bit better constrained. So then the question is, could we use dams to further refine that estimate? The answer was no. And here's why. What we really wanted to find was a multitude of dams across the landscape that looks something like this, whereby we've got a river coming in here at the upstream end, a nice big impoundment or reservoir where the majority of the sediment water will be slowed down and the majority of the sediment will be trapped within that reservoir. And it turns out it was really, really hard to find sites like this. This was one of the few that we were able to find. The majority of sites looked more like this, what we'd call a run-of-river dam. And what you can see is that the width of the river here is nearly identical to the width of the river downstream of the dam. That's to say there's no enlargement of the water body as a response to this damming because it's such a small dam. And this is really common throughout the Northeast. These were small dams built to power grist mills and sawmills, not massive public works like we might see in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. So to summarize this dam surveying data, we went around and quantified the amount of sediment in places like this, as well as some places like this, and then looked throughout all of our 3 study watersheds for Stockport Marsh, Tivoli Bays, and Iona Marsh, and characterized all the dams in those sub-watersheds. So for Stockport Creek watershed, there's 97 registered dams, and we found that only 4 look like this. That is, only 4 have large impoundments that are capable of trapping significant amounts of sediment. 23 were run-of-river dams, whereby the river was relatively large, the impoundment is relatively small, and as a result, these sites fill up with sediment on the order of months to maybe a few years, such that today they're not actually trapping sediment at present. Sediment enters via the upstream end, and there's often a scour pool just before the dam, and then sediment bypasses these dams. There are data from other studies showing where they've put little tags in cobbles, and they can actually see cobbles making it all the way through these types of dams. So we know that sediment moves right through these run-of-river dams. And then 70, the majority of the dams, were what we would call non-sources of sediment. These were natural lakes with a dam on them. So you can imagine a 40-foot deep lake with a 5-foot high dam. That dam has been placed there either for recreational purposes or to control vegetation by drawing down the water levels in the winter, to kill submerged aquatic vegetation, to kill weeds. And so there were lots of these dams. We also find these dams across small spring-fed ponds that don't have a significant stream coming into them. And so if you remove those dams, there'll be no added input of sediment to the estuary. So we call those non-sources. We used our 3 study watersheds to extrapolate, based on physiographic provinces, how much sediment is trapped across these main physiographic provinces of the lower Hudson River watershed. And what we see is in the Catskills, there's about 500 tons per kilometer squared of a scaled estimate of how much sediment is trapped in all the dams, all 1,700 dams of the lower Hudson watershed. We come up with an estimate of about 2.8 million tons has been stored over the last 100 or so years. And the dams vary in age. There are some much older than 100 years, some much less than 100 years, but on average, they're about 100 years old, sort of corresponding to the era of industrialization in the Northeast. And so to put this in perspective, this is about 2 years annual equivalent sediment load. It's also nearly identical to the amount of sediment that entered the estuary during Irene. And so what this tells us is that this massive amount of sediment, or what was perceived to be a massive amount of sediment stored behind dams, really is not that much in the grand scheme of things. We know that sediment that entered from Irene was largely trapped within the estuary, and we've seen the impacts of Irene in the estuary diminished within just a short period of time. And I'll show you some data to that effect in a little bit. So in short, the total amount of sediment stored in these 1,700 dams is relatively small because there are very few dams that actually trap sediment. So I want to contrast that with another part of the country. This is the Elwha River watershed in Washington State. Here we are in the Olympic Peninsula. The total watershed area is 832 kilometers squared. And when 2 dams were removed here, sort of a pretty high-profile dam removal process, 10.5 million tons of sediment was released, and there have been dramatic changes to the coastline here as a result of finally letting that sediment go. Contrast that with our region, some 1,700 dams in the lower Hudson River watershed. It's a much larger watershed, 1,300 square kilometers, yet the amount of sediment stored behind those dams, the potential to release, is less than a third of what is out in Washington State. And so there's 2 reasons for this. Here in the Northeast, we typically have lower watershed yields, and so the amount of coming out of our watersheds is less. And number 2, we have smaller dams. It's an earlier era of dam that were built by and large for a different purpose. Out west, these were large public works projects that differ in sort of their size and grandeur. All right, so this is sort of the concluding slide for dams, and I'll come back to it at the end, but I wanted to stop just for a second and see if there are any questions in the chat. So I'm looking in the chat box. I don't see anything. I'm going to look in the Q&A box as well, if I can find it. All right.
Brian, so there's a couple questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
We have one from Matt Collins. How are you accounting for bed load, your estimated total sediment load?
Thanks, Matt. So Matt's asking about how am I accounting for larger grain sizes like sand and cobbles that are transported along the bottom of the stream as opposed to stuff suspended like clays and silts? And Matt, the answer is we're not. We're making the assumption that the majority of sediment is suspended load, which is true for most parts of the world. It's a question the question remains, to what extent is that the case here in the Hudson River watershed? There's some data coming out of the Catskills right now by Jason Simeon and Mike McHale that I think will do they're sort of answering some of these questions. That said, we're just assuming the majority is suspended sediment. So the sediment yields could be slightly higher. I see another question from Andrew Payne, which is, how did we measure the amount of sediment behind the dams? Good question. To measure the sediment, we surveyed 6 dams in each watershed, and we did that via probing as well as ground penetrating radar. But in order to quickly assess large numbers of run-of-river dams, we came up with a formula and have actually put out a sediment estimating tool for the Hudson River Valley that I think is broadly applicable.
And folks, if you want to hang tight and submit any questions you might have before we move on to the marsh section. We can hear you.
Back in? Okay,
We're
phew.
back. Great.
All
So
right.
you were announcing, I'll let you know where you left off. You were announcing you had an equation. And
okay.
Everything after that point, we did not get to see this magical equation, so I'll let you take it away.
All right. I'm sorry. I forgot to speak to this part. As part of this project, we've published a tool. Well, it's not quite out yet, but we're calling it the Impoundment Mobile Sediment Estimation Tool for the Lower Hudson River Valley. And it's a pretty broadly applicable tool that I think will work across various regions. And essentially, it allows you to calculate the amount of sediment in a run-of-river dam as a function of the dam height and the impoundment area. And it's a really simple equation. I'll just write it on paper. The mass equals 0.2 times the dam height times the surface area of the impoundment. And so this 0.2, it comes from the bulk density of the impoundment sediment. We use an average value of 0.5 tons per cubic meter. And then also the average thickness of sediment behind a dam, which we considered 0.3 of the dam height. And so we end up with a coefficient of 0.2. The details of that will be published very soon on the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve website. So you'll be able to find it here at Dams and Sediment on the Hudson through the Herner website. We're just going through some final graphic design stuff before we get it up there. But that is a really exciting sort of outcome from this project. I'm looking at one more question. I think I'll maybe get to it, and so we can just sort of keep moving, keep continuity before we go too long. All right. So changing gears a little bit from the dams and now talking about the marshes, we looked again at the marshes at the mouths of 3 major tributaries. So the marsh at the mouth of the Stockport tributary is Stockport Flats. At the mouth, Tivoli Bays is actually 3 systems. So it's Tivoli North Bay, Tivoli South Bay, and then directly across from them is the mouth of the Esopus Creek, which is a really sediment-rich system, and it has a marsh developed at its delta as well. We looked at Vanderburg Cove right here, which is at about river kilometer 140. So here is Vanderburg Cove. And last, we look closest to the New York City at Iona Island Marsh, which is right here. In each of these marsh systems, there are anthropogenic modifications highlighted in black. So railroad here through Stockport Marsh. This is Stockport Creek coming out, and here's the marsh right around the corner. Esopus Delta has these jetties that have been built out to channelize the navigation channel of Esopus Creek, where there are several marinas. Vanderburg Marsh is behind the 1851 railroad causeway of the Hudson River line. Iona Island Marsh is on the other side of the river behind a railroad that was constructed about 20 years later. And then Tivoli North and South Bays are also behind that Hudson River line. You'll notice Tivoli North Bay is nearly entirely filled in with emergent marsh, and Tivoli South Bay is mostly shallow intertidal mudflat. It's mostly filled with water chestnut, trapanatans today. And so I'll be walking through sedimentology of a few of these sites and then summarizing some data from all of them. I'll also point out that I will make the case that out of all of these, the majority of these marshes owe their existence to these anthropogenic modifications. Only Iona Island Marsh, the ones we looked at, predates sort of industrial modifications to the river channel. Here is Tivoli North Marsh from above. Again, this is Tivoli Bays here. You can see the railroad berm, so we're looking out toward the Hudson River. Here's the Hudson main stem, looking down toward New York City to the left and up towards Albany to the right, the Catskill Mountains in the background, and a transect of cores that we collected across this segment of the marsh. Here's what the marsh looks like. This is me, graduate student Caroline Ladlow, and Waverly Lau here in the middle of this cattail marsh. So here's what this area looked like here's what it looks like today. Here's our transect of cores, and I'll show you the 3 cores that are closest to the railroad and closest to the main stem of the Hudson River, just because it's a lot of data to look at all of them. For each of the cores, I'll show you grain size, so depth on the y-axis. Sorry, the depth axis is not labeled. That's depth in centimeters. And on the x-axis, this is grain size in micrometers. The grain size D50 refers to the median grain size. Each of these has a red line indicating where we started to see zinc or heavy metals in the sediment, and we can use that to place an age constraint. We know regionally it corresponds to roughly the mid to late 1800s, and here we see a dramatic drop in grain size coincident with the rise in zinc. And so we interpret that dramatic drop in grain size as the construction of this railroad berm. We know that occurred in about 1850, and it would result in a dramatic reduction in the amount of energy here inside the cove. Prior to that occurrence, this was a relatively organic, poor sediment and a lot coarser than it is today. So probably a shallow shoal of the Hudson River, sort of a shallow, muddy shoal. After the railroad goes in, we see the organic content gradually begin to rise up to close to 40% or so toward the modern. As we move into the marsh, so moving toward the right in this transect, here's our subsequent 2 cores. You can see that grain size transition, again, coinciding with the onset of heavy metals. And again, here further into the marsh, again, this grain size transition and a gradual increase in organics toward the surface. And so what this is showing us is the slow, or I should say the rapid accumulation of sediment and the gradual turning on of marsh sediments and the building of root matter in the sediment, contributing to these high organic contents toward the surface. This was not something we were expecting to see at all. This, again, is one of these long-term study sites of the Herner Reserve. And so we sort of assumed it was a long-lived system. I think there were many other people, probably folks listening, who would have said, of course, we knew that was a modern feature, but this was news to the project team somewhat. And as we went up and down the system, we realized there were more and more of these anthropogenic marshes. One thing I want to point out is that this system is on average accreting at about 1 centimeter per year, or roughly 3 times the rate of sea level rise, indicating that this is a robust system. And despite the fact that its onset sort of is coincident with all these dams being built across the watershed, it has had no trouble in accumulating clastic sediment and building elevation. So next, I'll move upstream to Stockport Marsh. And again, this is at the mouth of that Stockport Creek watershed where we looked at those 97 dams. Here's the marsh. sort of on the downstream side of what looks like a deltaic feature. I'll show you that it is not, in fact, a deltaic feature. Here is the marsh stratigraphy. It's sort of silty mud with rootlets, with some silty sand at the bottom. We looked at the cesium data from this marsh. So this records the onset of cesium, records the onset of atmospheric radioactive bomb testing, corresponds to the mid-1950s. And we see that the sediment at the base of the marsh is relatively young. This was another really, really young system that has grown up in the last 70 or 80 years. And so here you can see the railroad is not directly interacting with the marsh. So what was causing this? I'll get to that in the next slide. Here you can see just a picture of that sediment, more clastic rich at the bottom and the organics increasing toward the top. So it becomes more organic rich at the top. And so the reason for this marsh is the piling of dredge spoils on the side of the river. And so this is something that started in the 1830s or so and really ramped up in the 1930s. Here's what the river channel looked like in 1930. The blue outline shows an island that develops in 1932. And so we could see, and this island is about 10 feet above sea level. And so it's not a deltaic feature. This is a big pile of dredge spoils just dumped there as a result of creating the navigational channel through here, or improving the navigation channel. So here are those dredge spoils. Here's what Stockport Flats looked like in 1960. And here's what it looks like in 1978. The marsh has built out roughly 400 meters in 18 years. So it's a really quick process once the conditions are created that allow for the sediments to accumulate in this sort of quiet area behind these dredge spoils and a sandy spit that built down from the dredge spoils. So on the one hand, it's really interesting and in some ways a little bit dismaying that these systems are so new, that they're really human-made systems. But on the other hand, it's a really promising story for the world of marsh creation and marsh restoration. There's a lot of interest right now in green-gray infrastructure and how do we build marshes to protect our coast and build coastal resiliency. And here are examples from the Hudson where this has really happened inadvertently. So I call it an inadvertent experiment in marsh seeding with great success. And be interested to see where this system moves over the next several decades. Here's what the stratigraphy looks like inside the marsh. So looking at three cores. SPM 7, 4, and 1, moving from the sort of marsh edge out to the water's edge. You can see again this reduction in grain size in each of these, indicated by the red dots, and an increase in the organic content as the marsh becomes established. Here again is the onset of cesium, indicated by 1954 in these two cores. And so we have a lot of evidence that this is in fact a very young system. Last, I'll take us down to toward Saline Estuary. This is Iona Island Marsh. So now we're in the brackish part of the river. The river here is usually fairly fresh, but salt comes into the bottom waters of the river here. You can see it's a really beautiful site. This is just below Bear Mountain. We took a transected course going north-south and east-west. And there's a lot of data here. I don't expect to look at all of it, but I do want to zero in on the zinc. I've mentioned these heavy metal onsets here. I'm actually showing the data. And you can see the zinc here, instead of showing up at about 150 or 60 centimeters like we saw at Dibley North, here it shows up at about 40 centimeters depth, indicating a much slower deposition rate. In addition to that, the organic content is much higher here, in excess of 50% in many of our cores. And here's what that core looks like. It's this really organic, rich peat material with not a lot of clastic content. So this is an old marsh. We know this from previous studies by Dorothy Petit and others. It goes back about 6,000 or 7,000 years. And we can see, despite the fact that this railroad was built at recent, the lithology and accumulation rates have not changed dramatically at Iona Marsh. And so it's a great marsh with which to contrast some of these more anthropogenic marshes. I'm going to skip a little bit about Vanderburg Cove. It's another system we looked at. You can see the rapid development of Vandenberg Cove. In 1960, at the mouth of this creek in Vandenberg Cove, there was essentially no marsh. And by 1995, we see a dramatic increase in the marsh area. We collected cores across these sites here. I'm going to just skip these because we're dragging a little bit. I want to get to the punchline. The punchline is this has been a very important process for marsh creation up and down the Hudson. Not just railroad berms, but also dredge spoils, as well as channel meander cutoffs in the upper reaches of the Hudson estuary, have created these areas where fine-grained sediments can accumulate and transition into marsh as that elevation builds. And so what we find is, in total, more than half of the emergent marsh on the Hudson River is anthropogenic. And in total, these anthropogenic marshes and coves trap about 7% of the annual sediment load of the river. So they comprise a really important habitat type within the river, in large part, hopefully making up for many of the marshes that have been lost over the years due to land reclamation closer to New York City, and hopefully providing some of those ecosystem services that have been lost, as well as carbon sequestration. They trap about 7% of the annual sediment load, so it's not like they're starving downstream reaches of sediment either. Looking at what are these marshes, so here we're looking at area of marsh on the y-axis, broken out by different types of tidal wetlands. The green represents anthropogenic marshes, ones that I've mapped in GIS, versus total marsh area. And what you can see here is in the cattail bars, 2/3 of the emergent cattail marsh, so which makes up sort of the dominant native or somewhat native freshwater tidal marsh on the Hudson, is these anthropogenic tidal marshes. Interestingly, water chestnut seems to be doing really well in all systems, whether they're natural or anthropogenic. So looking just a little bit, sort of summarizing the lithology of these marshes. Here, the marshes are separated out anthropogenic marshes, so Stockport Marsh, Sopus Delta, Tivoli North, and Vandenberg Marsh we're considering anthropogenic marshes. Anthropogenic coves, Tivoli South and Vandenberg Cove, neither of which have marsh yet, but both of which are cordoned off by railroads. And then Iona being our natural marsh example, or at least long-lived. What you can see here is that the accretion rates across all anthropogenic sites are well in excess of sea level rise here at about 3 millimeters per year. Coves are roughly double, and our marshes are 3 to 4 times the rate of sea level rise. So painting a sort of a promising picture for marshes today, at least on the Hudson River. In terms of organic content, it seems like once marshes becomes well established, like this long-lived Iona marsh, they rely largely on organic production and in situ production of root material to keep pace with sea level rise. Tivoli North Marsh is our most well-established anthropogenic marsh, and so it has sort of the highest organic contents. And these two cove sites are made up mostly of clastic material. So what this says is if you want to build a marsh and you want a shallow intertidal area to transition to marsh, you need to have a relatively high flux of clastic material. And so the last one is just looking at the flux of clastic material in grams per centimeter squared per year. And you can see here the coves receive quite a bit of clastic material. Marsh, this natural marsh, is not acquiring much clastic material at present. And it seems to be from our cores that's been sort of the case for the last several hundred, if not 1,000 or so years. Plotting these same data in sort of different space with deposition rate on the x-axis and organic content on the y-axis. Here's relative sea level rise at about 3 millimeters per year, just under 3 millimeters per year. Our human-made marshes of the Hudson all have deposition rates well in excess of that 3 millimeter per year sea level rise, and relatively low organic content. Here, old marshes on the Hudson, so Piermont from a previous study by Peterson et al., and this is Iona Marsh from our study, have much higher organic contents and lower accumulation rates. And this is from another study, recent study in Jamaica Bay by Dorothy Petit et al., showing again high organic content and relatively low elevation building at Jamaica Bay Marsh. Contrast that with one other site. This is a dredge channel from Jamaica Bay, and here you can see really high deposition rates in this dredge channel, indicating that potentially part of the reason we're seeing marsh loss in Jamaica Bay is due to the trapping of sediment in these over-deepened parts of Jamaica Bay, impeding the ability for that sediment to get to the marsh platform. And this is highlighted in this paper, Petit et al. 2018. So what's next for marsh studies? Where I'm hoping to go next with this, and other along with Sarah Fernald and John Woodruff, is to try to create a tool to guide future marsh restoration in the Hudson River estuary. And so in part of this, we need to better understand modern sediment trapping processes across seasons and tidal cycles. How does clastic sediment get to these locations, both to marshes as well as coves that have not transitioned to marsh? Two, identify locations where marshes are likely to develop. And so look at to what extent have we protected those areas in terms of land conservation and allowing marshes to move inland and upland with sea level rise. And three, along with Phil Horton at Stevens Institute, looking at examining potential impacts to marshes of surge barrier, looking at how that'll change tidal inundation, sediment transport, and ultimately the fate of marshes. I think I'm going to skip this last slide. I'll just say briefly, this bottom panel looks at the response of turbidity in the estuary after Hurricane Irene. We saw 2 years of increased turbidity in the estuary, which relaxed again by about 2014. So we use this as an analog for a massive amount of sediment released from dams. We would expect the impacts to be relatively short-lived. I want to get to conclusions and say, in conclusion, the role of dams in trapping sediment is relatively small. There's a small role of dams in trapping sediment, and that's because there are very few effective sediment traps across the landscape. The majority of these run-of-river dams and natural lakes and spring-fed ponds that are dammed up. Second main conclusion is that a lot of the dams, a lot of the marshes on the Hudson River estuary are man-made, and we have lots of great examples of inadvertently created marshes that we can use to learn more about how to do this intentionally moving forward. And three, I didn't get to speak to this much, but the turbidity in the estuary following Hurricane Irene only lasted for about 2 years. And so with that, I want to point you to some citations that I mentioned in the paper, as well as preprints of manuscripts detailing some of these conclusions in more detail. And with that, I'll stop for questions. So I'm going to open it up. It looks like we've got questions in both the chat box and the Q&A box. I'm going to just try and find both of those. All right, Lucy, would you like to take over?
Sure. Great. So for folks on the line, just so you know, these materials are available on our website, and I will post the link to that in the chat, as well as in a follow-up email to all of you. And also, this is being recorded, so I hope that'll be of help to you. Brian, in terms of some of the questions that came up, let's see, we have a few.
You know, I can see them. I actually can see them, Lucy. So I think I'll just go ahead and read them.
Sure.
Okay.
Great.
So I see one from Ken Tagaki, which says, it looks like the large dams on the Elwha are on the main stem, not on tributaries. If large dams were built in main stem of the Hudson, would we see an increase in impoundment sediment similar to scale to the Elwha? Great question. So the Elwha River is a similar size to some of the major tributaries to the Hudson. So it's a similar watershed area to, say, the Roll of Jansen Kill or Stockport Creek. Stockport Creek is actually bigger than the Elwha River. And Stockport Creek does have many, many dams on its main stem, on its two main stems, the Claverack and the Kinderhook Creeks. And so we do have analogs for the Elwha in that case, and those dams really don't have much sediment. If large dams were built, say, up in the Adirondacks, or in some ways, I guess we do have large dams up in the Catskills, there would be a significantly more sediment trapped, But for perspective, the Ashokan Reservoir, which is sort of the biggest dam in the whole system, traps has had its total inventory is about 500,000 tons. So it would increase. So if you were to release all that sediment again, it would still be only increase our estimate of total trapped sediment by about 20%. So really, we have much less sediment yields, lower sediment yields on the East Coast. And really, the Ashokan Reservoir is really sort of an outlier in this area in terms of its size and sediment trapping ability. All right, I'll take another question. We see deltaic features on the Ohio River, new since river regulation raised the river for navigation. It's interesting to consider conservation of highly disruptive systems as novel or accidental. Yeah, it's a great point from Kate. Similar to the Ohio River, these marshes are very much an anthropogenic byproduct. That said, they're definitely providing lots of ecosystem services in terms of habitat and in terms of carbon sequestration. And so I think, you know, writing them off would be not a good idea. Next question is 3 millimeters a year a current figure for sea level rise in the Hudson River area? Yes, that's from the battery. So a really long-lived tide phase at the battery. And in New Jersey, the current rate is about 5.5 millimeters per year. Certainly it's changing. I don't know to what extent the curve at the battery is curved at the end. I don't think we've seen a big inflection point yet in New York. But definitely the relative sea level rise changes as a function of location. Another question from Scott Croft. Some recreational boat access points, marinas, etc., struggle with siltation at low water and the high cost of dredging. Some of which is the cost to transport those spoils to distant storage areas. It seems that this is if these access points could dredge and place spoils locally, it would be a win-win. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of folks have pointed to the utility or sort of the usefulness of dredge spoils. We should be treating them not as a liability, but as an asset. Certainly dredge material is used a lot to spray sediment on sediment-starved areas. To the extent we could use it to place it in locations behind which marsh could develop, I think that's a really promising area. Sorry, I'm going to try to slow down a little bit. You've mentioned the role of the railroad berm on marshes. What about the role of many historic causeways on the Hudson? Some have large shallows nearby. Not sure what the historic causeways they're referring to. There's the railroad causeways, which are definitely widespread. All right, I'm going to look to the chat window. Sorry. A few more questions. Is sediment remaining in the impoundment old, or is it being replaced with weather events? Good question. So for these run-of-river impoundments, the assumption is that a lot of the sediment in there is old and that modern sediment has been bypassing it. One example I looked at with one of our stakeholder groups was a dam on Fishkill Creek. I forget when it was built, probably 1920s or so, and it probably filled with sediment within about 3 months based on the size of the sediment and the sediment yields for that region. And so there's about 3 months worth of 1930s era sediment in that dam. And then all the subsequent sediment for the last 90 or so years has been bypassing that dam. Yeah, so whatever the quality of sediment was at that time is going to be reflective of the sediment stored in that dam. Another question from Alexander Sokol. What are the effects on wildlife or aquatic life or general health? I'm guessing that's reference to these anthropogenic marshes. Well, a lot of studies have been done, especially on Tivoli North Bay, which is one of these long-term ecological sites of the Herner Reserve. And so I can't speak to that in great detail. I'm certainly not an ecologist. But Eric Kiviat and Stuart Finlay, as well as the reserve staff, have been studying sort of the turtles and muskrats and vegetation of those coves for a long time. but I can't speak to sort of the aquatic health. Another question is, do you think marsh seeding experiment at Stockport would have been successful in the presence of other threats such as high nutrient loading? Great question. So it looks like Stockport Marsh really developed in large part in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So sort of pre-Clean Water Act, in an era when certainly the Connecticut River here in New England was called America's best landscape sewer, because municipal sewage treatment really was not occurring. So that Stockport Marsh really developed during a time of high nutrient loading. Whether it would develop today is an interesting question. I know, for instance, Vanderburg Cove, we saw a lot of marsh expansion between the 70s and 80s, which has really ceased at present, and we're not sure why. It's an interesting question whether the nutrient loading was really allowing the marsh to spread rapidly, and that has sort of ceased now that the river's cleaned up. I can't speak. It's a great question. I'm not sure about protocols. Typically, the speaker tries to sort of wrap up to allow people to leave the room. This being a webinar, I'm sure people have been leaving continually, and so I think I'll just keep answering questions since folks can sort of leave at any time. Does that sound okay, Jim and Lucy?
That sounds great.
That sounds great, Brian. Thanks.
Okay. Another question from Emily Steffen. Do you have any surface elevation tables set up in any of these marshes? Yes. Sarah Fernald and her staff have set up surface elevation tables in Tivoli North Bay, as well as Iona Island Marsh. And in general, the accumulation rates observed there are roughly in sync with what we're seeing from sediment cores. Another question is from Louis Kleinman. With sea level rise of at least 3 feet, can you identify where future marshes will develop, barring human intervention? Great question, Louis. I think probably the best resource there is Nava Tabak's work, which was published in 2016, looking at 50 or so sites up and down the river that, based on elevation, could accommodate new marshes. So she used something called the SLAM model, sea level affecting marsh, migration. And so that's a great resource. Some of the future work that my group has planned is to look at sediment supply side of the equation. Where do we think the sediment supply is sufficient to fill in these low-lying areas with marsh as sea level rises? But that's a great question, and it's definitely some place where I'm interested in moving forward. Eric Rothstein asks, can you speak to any vegetation changes over the time in freshwater tidal systems? So to answer Eric's question, one of the best resources we have for that is all of the vegetation of the tidal wetlands in the Hudson was mapped in 2007. Piermont was redone in 2014, and as a sort of a drastic takeover by Phragmites between 2007 and 2014. And going back, if you look back in the literature to some of the earlier work done by Dorothy Petit's group at Piermont, you can see at that location it was mostly Spartina alterniflora, so mostly a salt marsh system back in the 90s, transitioning to Phragmites at present, which is somewhat disheartening. Further upstream, we have a great snapshot of what it looked like in 2007. I've been back to some of those areas way upstream by Skodak Island and have seen the expansion of Phragmites into cattail. And so that's sort of, again, a little bit disheartening. And that's out sort of my knowledge area, though, so I can't speak as to why that's occurring. Another question from Daniel Wolf. Do your data suggest removing small dams to improve fish runs would have little sediment impact on Hudson's main stem? Great question. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, that's exactly what our data suggests and what I'm trying to emphasize. I hope that these results and these conclusions can be a boon to dam removal process, basically to say that the removal of dams is going to have little impact on the estuary in terms of physical habitat and in terms of siltation and turbidity. And so to the extent that that's a concern, I hope that that can be sort of taken down as one of the many barriers to dam removal. Dam removal still remains an incredibly difficult process for a variety of reasons, but I hope that this research can say this is one thing that we do not need to be so concerned about. Josh Ward asked, is PCD contamination in these sediments a concern? Are there specific sites where this is a problem? Great question, Joshua. So really what he's asking about is sediment quality. That's one thing we didn't look at in any depth. Didn't have budget to look at sort of contamination and sort of send samples off to environmental labs. That said, we do know that the main stem of the Hudson has abundant PCBs, and in all likelihood, many of these tributaries have less, if not none, than the Hudson. That said, there's a whole panoply of industrial histories here, from felting to paper making to logging that bring with them their own contaminants of concern. And so there would be some concern with contaminants. With respect to run-of-river dams, we know that all of this sediment has been moving downstream for decades, and the amount of sediment often stored in those run-of-river dams is anywhere from a few months to a few years of sediment. And so really I'd make the argument that in terms of downstream transport, I don't think it would have a huge impact on sort of environmental quality of downstream habitat. Ed McGowan asks, would you expect sedimentation rates at anthropogenic marshes to converge on Iona's rate as they mature over time? Yeah, great question. So we've looked at elevation, and certainly the elevation of the anthropogenic marshes relative to mean high water remains somewhat lower. That's to say that they are still coming into equilibrium with mean high water, whereas these older marshes like Iona have been in equilibrium with sea level rise for thousands of years. And I would expect that sedimentation rates at the anthropogenic marshes would start to converge on sea level rise as the elevation starts to converge. And I think that's really already occurring at Tivoli North Bay, and the set data really help to confirm that. One more question from Louis Kleinman. Have you compared sediment composition between the very old and the newer sediments? I.e., are there meaningful differences between old marshes and new marshes? Absolutely. And so here this sort of gets at some of those differences. Here's Iona. Our old marsh tends to be very rich in organics, so this is organics, and very poor in plastics. And if we contrast that with our anthropogenic marshes, they have relatively low organic contents and relatively high mineral accumulation rates. All right, I think I've gotten through all the questions, and just walked back.
Brian, Jim Lodge, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Jim.
Hey, thank you so much. This was really excellent, and thank you for persevering through our technical challenges, and real trooper. And I'll give a virtual applause from the foundation and everyone out there. I think, excellent talk, and really appreciate it. To everyone still on the webinar, please accept our apologies again for our technical challenges. I don't think all of them are ours, but we'll own them for today, and we'll see if we can figure out how to do a better job. But again, thanks for sticking with us, and again, thank you, Brian, for an excellent talk. And I said in my opening, a really impressive work, and look forward to seeing the papers that come out of it.
Great, thanks for having me, Jim.
Take care. Bye all.
Bye all. All right, so just a final wrap up. Thanks so much for joining us, and all the slides are available on our website, as well as the recording of this webinar should be up by the end of the week.
Thanks, Lizzie.
All right, bye Brian, thank you so much.